Hey, Michael, over to you.
Okay, so um, my bio was presented on the Azure user group, but I've been in the tech industry for over 20 years or so. Been stumbling around in the cloud for the last half of that 20 years. Have worked in automation, healthcare, and e-commerce. And as Nick discussed earlier, I'm currently working as retail with our DevOps team, and we're really working to improve our abilities of our organization and capitalizing on Azure. So I've been taking a deeper dive and looking to the cloud adoption framework that's available now for Azure that Microsoft's developed. It's a huge amount of resource available there that I have found extremely valuable. Would have been great to have this 5 years ago even to really help. It really does smooth and help guide people's cloud migrations. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick off into my presentation here. So first, let's identify what the cloud adoption framework is. The Cloud Adoption Framework brings together cloud adoption best practices from thousands of Microsoft employees, partners, and customers, and provides a set of tools and guidance and narratives that help shape technology, business, and people's strategies for driving desired business outcomes during your adoption effort. It does follow agile principles and requires a growth mindset. This guidance aligns to the phases of the cloud adoption lifecycle and gives you easy access to the right guidance at the right time. So now hearing this glowing description of what the cloud adoption framework is, let's jump in and discuss the first potential pitfall to avoid. While the cloud adoption framework has the intent of providing a self-service approach to cloud adoption with the resources it has available, it's important to consider strategic partnership alignment. Very few corporations have the diversity of skills required to support the strategy, planning, readiness, adoption, governance, and management that's required on a cloud journey. There's partners and other support models that are often necessary to fill in these gaps and to help the teams with their skills and their responsibilities. And I mentioned here 3 different approaches you can use with Microsoft that they can provide you with Azure solution providers, their partners. There's also a fast track program for Azure and an Azure migration program that you can get in contact with your Microsoft representative, and they can help you out. I, of course, did not avoid this pitfall on more than one occasion. And have been practicing in an anti-pattern without the resources that are currently available on the cloud adoption framework. I've also engaged with partners on efforts as well, migrating to the cloud, and that tends to be a much smoother program, a much smoother progression. The resources available in the cloud adoption framework, however, are very similar to what we've used with those partners and can really help you facilitate whether you're with a partner or doing this independently. So we're going to review the phases of the cloud adoption lifecycle, which consists of these 3 main phases here that have the dashed outline. Those 3 main phases are plan, ready, and adopt. And those phases are completed in iterative cycles. These 3 main stages are preceded by a business strategy phase. And there's additional phases that align with governance and management that kind of expand through the entire cloud adoption journey. During the strategy phase, you define your business objectives. During the planning phase, you prepare your organization for the cloud. During the ready phase, you prepare your environments to move workloads to the cloud. I really like the second view of the phases of the cloud adoption framework because it really puts that defining strategy in the center. Everything revolves around defining that strategy and continuing to refine that strategy. And then that's encircled by the iterative 3 main phases of plan, ready, and adopt. And all of that actually is functioning within the govern and manage phases. So I think this view is a good, accurate view. So let's go ahead and dig a little deeper into the first phase of the journey, which is defining your strategy. It involves the 4 steps in which you define and document your motivations, you document your business outcomes, you develop your business case, and then you choose the right project. So regarding that first step there, defining and documenting your motivation, this really requires you to understand and have participation from all your stakeholders. There's a great variance in motivations between stakeholders. On the business side, it might be quite different than what it would be on your technical side. It could be that your organization is preparing for new technical capabilities, that they're needing to gain scale to meet market or geographic demands. Could be that they want to reduce vendor or technical complexity. Lots of times these strategic discussions are triggered by critical business events. And in this slide, we kind of highlight several critical business events that I've witnessed organizations experiencing. Lots of those are data center exit that I've seen, as well as contract renegotiations. And then there's kind of those critical business events, but there's also kind of 2 paths that your cloud journey usually takes. And they diverge slightly, but they also supplement each other, and they're to migrate and innovate. So it's important to have the right motivations defined early on, because those decisions will later define whether you migrate or whether you innovate. So it's important here to get all stakeholder involvement as well. When I have functioned more as an independent cloud evangelist, I would call it, a small team or a team of 1 or 2 to go out and build your cloud infrastructure. We didn't have proper alignment with the business. We didn't have enough business stakeholder buy-in, and it really did make the transition much more difficult. It's best to have all stakeholders in these conversations and understand their motivations and align the technical and business motivations to develop your path. So the business outcome step of your strategy phase is where you document your agreed upon business outcomes. So the cloud adoption framework provides business outcome templates to help drive these conversations. These conversations are usually focused around fiscal outcomes, agility outcomes, reach outcomes, or growth outcomes, and customer engagement outcomes. And they provide some good examples of those for you on the cloud adoption framework side. We go into more pitfall avoidance there. When you're defining those business outcomes, it's important to identify and really have meaningful KPIs. It's important to have proper stakeholder involvement and to really take a look at the problem as kind of this this house model over here, where at the base, you've got your organizational capabilities and the solutions and the ecosystems that you currently have, and to understand what business outcomes you're driving toward, what the drivers behind those business outcomes are, because that really helps you identify your KPIs. And at the top level, to kind of have that oversight to make sure that your stakeholders are fully involved. Oh, got a little carried away on the slides there. Okay. Third step in the strategy phase is business justification. The business justification changes quite a bit when you move to a cloud accounting model versus your standard normal accounting models. It's difficult for people who've been kind of functioning in a cost center model or a profit center model that is quite a bit different than a cloud model. And the cloud adoption framework does provide quite a bit of documentation regarding how to have your accounting stakeholders able to more transition to kind of this cloud approach of identifying your business justification through cost. Basically, it's a return of investment is equal to the gain of the initial investment minus the initial investment divided by initial investment. So what does all of those things mean? Basically, that gain from investment is your revenue deltas and your cost deltas. So your revenue deltas should be forecast in partnership with your business stakeholders. Your cost deltas, they're the amount of increase or decrease that will be caused by the transformation. And there's a lot of variables to take into account with those deltas. Earnings are largely based on hard costs like capital expenses reduction, cost avoidance, operational cost reduction, depreciation reductions. There's a lot to be taken into this account. There's a lot of soft cost avoidance is what I refer to them as well, and soft cost reduction, which is, you're able to avoid things like re-upping all your hardware. You're able to manage more in the cloud than you can when it's on-prem, which can result in a headcount reduction. So there's tools available that are some. I was very aware of the Azure pricing calculator. I've been using that quite frequently as I got further into the cloud adoption framework. I finally realized that they had some additional tooling within the total cost of ownership calculator that really is helpful from a accounting and finance perspective. And then there are also tooling in regards to Azure cost management that we'll also review a little later in the presentation. So some common pitfalls to avoid during this phase is there's a lot of myths about moving to the cloud that you need to make sure that people are understanding and you're basically dispelling these myths. There's a myth that the cloud is always cheaper. It's commonly believed that operating a data center in the cloud is always going to be cheaper than on-premise. And while this may be generally true, it's not always the case. Sometimes cloud operating costs are actually higher. And these higher costs are often caused by lack of governance, misaligned systems architecture, process duplication, some atypical system configurations, or even greater staffing costs. There's also a myth that everything should go into the cloud. Some people believe that the cloud enables so much that there's no room for that hybrid data model, but the hybrid is definitely the most common pattern you're used, that people aren't moving everything in the cloud, they're not keeping everything on-prem, that they're actually using a hybrid hosting model. Also, there's a belief that mirroring their on-premise environment will help save money in the cloud. There's been a lot of lift and shift efforts that have failed miserably, and I've seen a lot of customers, a lot of organizations frustrated that they basically took what they were doing on-prem, moved it to the cloud, and they, in addition to not seeing costs, they've actually seen more cost than what they previously had, and they had a lot of frustrations, and they didn't build it in a cloud-friendly way, and it actually was less stable. So that lift and shift can be a dangerous path to follow. And then some of those additional myths are that an operating expense model is better than a capital expense model, and that's not necessarily the case. That's something each organization will have to review with their finance and with their accounting departments, and come to a decision on how to manage those models. There's new things to consider, such as bandwidth limitations. There's migration timelines. There's also for companies that are new to moving to cloud, there's quite a bit of skills gap there that may need additional expenses to cover and affect timelines as well. So moving to the cloud is definitely not like flipping a switch. So the final step of the strategy phase is choosing your first cloud adoption project. That first cloud project could be chosen by a critical business event. If perhaps your organization had an outage related to on-premise limitations, be that your internet providers or whoever you're getting your connection to the internet, even with redundancy, you had some outages, some failures. Lots of times that lines up with a critical business event that kind of pushes you off into the cloud. And there's tooling specifically that can help you in those critical business events move more quickly. And the cloud adoption framework highlights how you can use the Azure Migrate tool and Azure Site Recovery as well, and kind of guides you through some steps and practices and toolings to use those. Whenever the migration is a primary motivation, it's wise to start with the migration of non-critical workloads. So they also suggest starting your first project adoption in parallel with the development of the next phase, the planning phase. That it does offer the ability to establish a growth of mindset to encourage learning and exploration, as well as provide an opportunity for the team to develop the skills, create situations to encourage new approaches and identify gaps. But also I see that as that could definitely be a pitfall as well. If you go and start building without having a little bit better understanding of what the availability is and what the capabilities in the cloud and how that they've changed from how you've been doing business before. Lots of times what's built out there in the first pass without following some of the plan efforts in the next phase incurs a lot of technical debt. So let's get into the plan phase. The plan phase consists of 4 steps. They include rationalizing your digital estate, developing your initial organizational alignment, creating your skills readiness plan, and finally creating your cloud adoption plan. So most organizations tend to focus their energy around rationalizing their digital estate and the creation of that cloud adoption plan. I really believe the reason is most people are comfortable with rationalizing their digital estate because they're very familiar with their current on-prem infrastructure and they're very knowledgeable of it, and they're able to focus and get quick wins of doing that inventory. In addition, the team is usually pretty excited to move to the cloud, so they're pretty aggressive in wanting to get their cloud adoption plan rolling. But another pitfall I see is really common is these 2 steps 2 and 3, are often minimally addressed or not even addressed at all. So the most important aspect of any cloud adoption plan is the alignment of people who will make that plan a reality. No plan is complete until you understand its people and aspects. It's not just tooling, it's people and processes as well as culture. So throwing your organization in the cloud without a skills readiness plan can have devastating effects. In addition to having lost a lot of cycles, it can also destroy your team's morale by not having an opportunity to bridge skill gaps and to give them training opportunities. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the first step here in the plan, which is rationalizing your digital estate. It generally follows the guidelines of using the 5 R's here, right? Rehost, refactor, re-architect, and rebuild, and renew, and replace. So there's opportunity here to identify where you can maybe reduce capital expense, maybe like free up data center space, or achieve rapid return on your investment in the cloud by doing that inventory and quickly identifying opportunities where each one of the 5 R's fit best. Helps you kind of then build that that list of opportunity for you. So the refactor there is also refers to application development processes of refactoring code to allow an application to deliver on new business opportunities. You know, there's an opportunity there to experience faster and shorter updates, benefited from that code portability, and achieve greater cloud efficiency in the areas of resource, cost, and speed. So, and for re-architecting, that's usually around gaining application scale and agility, and also adopt new cloud capabilities more easily. Within this as well, it's really important to keep it simple and make it quick. One thing that isn't highlighted as well here is to ensure that you do have a proper partner alignment as you're going through and classifying each one of these into one of the 5 R's. You can get stuck in analysis paralysis, where you're over analyzing your current workloads. In addition, choosing the correct 5 R for that is difficult for someone to do unless they have a good experience in knowing what capabilities are available in the cloud. So, as we previously mentioned, another step in the plan phase of that organizational alignment, phase 2, that's often skipped. You know, it's required to create a balance between speed and control at a minimum. So you really should have people accounted for at a minimum, the cloud adoption, the cloud governance. To align your organization within this, you can see that there's an adopt only, an MVP best practice, a central IT strategic alignment, operational alignment, and a cloud center of excellence. And this is a maturity model. It's not normally the case that you would start with your initial effort already having developed and have a functioning cloud center of excellence. But it is something that as you mature and your surface area in the cloud increases, it's something you want to strive to achieve. And as previously mentioned as well, the skills readiness. It's a good idea to develop a plan to capture concerns, identify gaps, and partner across teams. That way you're able to identify a plan to bridge those gaps and repurpose, reskill current people or expand your team in order to supply the skills that are going to be required to meet your cloud adoption. The final step of your plan phase is where you develop your actual cloud adoption plan. That cloud adoption plan converts the aspirational goals of a cloud adoption strategy into an actionable plan. It is an iterative project plan that helps a company transition from traditional IT approaches to more modern agile approaches. And the cloud adoption framework provides an Azure DevOps template to help you generate a project plan for you, and that generator is extremely helpful. So I'm going to give a quick demo here of utilizing that tool. So with this, you simply select the link that's provided on the Cloud Adoption Framework site. You log in, select your organization, and you select your template. I'm going to do the Cloud Adoption Framework recommended template, but just to make you familiar, there's additional templates available. There's a Cloud Adoption Plan. There's also an Azure Governance Readiness project template that is extremely useful as well, depending on what stage of your cloud adoption journey you're on. And then there's some other cool ones regarding Sentinel. But let's go back here to where I was. And yeah, basically all you do is you complete that, add your project name, select your org, and it'll deploy it for you. Create the project. After that's done spinning up, you'll see that now it's within that organization. It has created a new project for you. It has your backlog created for you. Your backlog, it consists of the epics, features, and user stories that you would use on this journey. And it has good references within it as well to resources that are available out on the Cloud Adoption Framework site. So I highly recommend grabbing one of these projects, getting it into Azure DevOps. It really can go all the way down and break down your tasks for you and really help guide you along your cloud adoption journey. Okay, so that cloud adoption plan, again, with that, you want to make sure that you got all your prerequisites done, you define your prioritized workload, you align your asset workloads, establish iteration and release plans, and estimate timelines. So while you've got a valuable template within there, it is a skeleton. So you will need to continue to add your prioritized workloads and align those. Let's move on to the next is the ready phase. So the ready phase is really where the Cloud Adoption Framework shines by providing a lot of tools and automation to get you quickly on your path. The ready phase is broken down into 4 areas, and the tooling within this is really pretty amazing stuff. So the Azure Setup Guide, which I'm going to bring up, really does a great job here of ensuring that you start off on the right foot. It discusses about topics that are common when you first start into the cloud and decisions that you have to make that are critical to getting alignment with, because these are things that you will have technical debt carried on for quite some time if you're not focusing on these at the right time during your ready phase. So they provide recommendations here for how to organize your Azure resources. They start with the management groups and subscriptions and the resource group. Most the organizations I've been at had their space in Azure created before management groups were even available. So that's something that your organization may need to be adding, even if they've got an established footprint in the cloud. They talk about naming standards, which, while there's not a definite right and wrong way to choose your naming convention, it is important to remain consistent across your organization regarding naming standards. In addition, they talk about tags. And resource tags is something that I see a lot of missed opportunity in. Lots of times there's assets being created that there's lots of opportunities for automation and reporting and that can be these tags can be extremely valuable and useful for. So they provide some guidance there. Then the next component was managing access, which is quite a bit different in the cloud for people to understand what actually these role-based access controls are and identifying a strategy for managing them. There's also management costs and billing resources available here, because it's easy for you to see your costs just kind of get extrapolated, because there's not limits to what you're able to do in the cloud unless you've got some policy enabled. So proactively having a plan to manage your costs with Azure's cost and billing management will definitely prevent you from having to answer for expenses. There's also some recommendations in here regarding governance, security, and compliance. And that is really where the tooling gets pretty cool, because they talk here about Azure policy with the Azure blueprints. And they also talk about the Azure security centers. Both blueprints and the security center could basically take up an entire length of a presentation themselves. But I would like to review a little bit about the Azure blueprints. So there's a getting started here on the blueprints that allows you to create a blueprint. Specific with the cloud adoption framework, there's some pre-made blueprints that if you choose, Cloud Adoption Framework Foundation. There's another one called the Cloud Adoption Migration Landing Zone, which is also provides some that Azure Migrate tooling and some additional capabilities there. These are very simple to deploy. You choose your blueprint and you create your own blueprint name that you would like to have. You define the location where you want to have that stored, in which subscription. And next, you are able to go in here and edit your artifacts for the blueprint. So with each one of these are basically deploying policy. You can see here there's different artifact types, whether they're policy assignments, whether they're deploying resource manager templates for resource groups. There's a key vault that's deployed within this one. There's also a log analytics space that's deployed into this one. And this one also allows you to add networks as well. What these do is they're basically providing you a landing zone that is using the Cloud Adoption Framework's recommended best practices to get you started. And there's additional blueprints that you can choose as well. Let's take a look now. I believe I've got some deployment in here already. I'm in the right subscription, which I might not be. Yeah, so let's filter that down. I can type. Try this one more time. Yeah, so that Cloud Adoption Framework just deploys these resource groups. It deploys a shared service resource group that has your Azure Key Vault and sets up your log analytics and your storage account. In addition, you can take a look at the policies that are deployed. And the policies that are included within there are enabled on your subscription that you choose, and allows you to restrict, for example, the resource types that you're even allowed to be deployed within that subscription. And also, you can manage the storage account SKUs that are available to be deployed within that subscription. There's also some security related ones regarding secure transfer. You can also choose what regions, what compute types of machines, and what it does is ensures that as people are beginning their cloud adoption journey, that they're following what you've defined as proper resource creation in Azure. Okay, get that out of it. So I also wanted to take a look at one last thing when we're talking about landing zones. There's more than one way to deploy your landing zones. In addition, there's different landing zone definitions. These are, you're able to use blueprint landing zones. They've got both the CAF Foundation blueprint, which we just reviewed. If you're going to do the migration landing zone, they recommend that you first deploy your CAF Foundation, then land your migration. On top of that, it will not create redundant resources. There's also an enterprise scale landing zone, which just has more capabilities within it and is for larger organizations or people more matured on their path. And then there's also the Cloud Adoption Terraform modules. And this is something that I've yet to have the opportunity to explore, but I'm pretty excited about pulling it down and playing with it. They've got an architectural diagram here that lays out the different components. As you can see, much of it aligns with the same as the foundation, but it's actually a Terraform project. And there's a Terraform provider specifically for this. Okay. So in your ready phase, that Azure setup guide, I did a quick review of the recommendations that they have for organizing your resources, managing access. There's also some information in there that I think is valuable. Oh, let me pull this up. As you're moving into Azure, the need to be able to stay in touch with product updates and to be involved in a proactive change management as it pertains to your cloud infrastructure. This is a good resource to have. Being aware of Azure Service Health and knowing the capabilities there to set up alerting, as well as just visibility into current service issues on the Azure platform. This is extremely helpful. Also, there's Azure updates regarding product announcements, the blogs, which I'm sure most users in most people in this user group are probably aware of. And then there's also service specific blogs. Then there's some additional resources here that they provide as well. Anything in here? There's a whole new way to be able to view monitoring and reporting compared to on-premise solutions that people have in place. And there's a pretty big learning curve to understanding what tools and capabilities are available in the cloud. So I think it's important to do a thorough review of how to, for example, query and analyze logs, as well as monitor your systems. Okay, so I kind of already reviewed through that Azure landing zone and gave a brief overview of what that lands in there. And I reviewed the fact that there are several blueprints available. These things are being constantly contributed to, and there's constantly more of them being developed. I think the blueprints actually might still kind of be a preview feature, but I've been able to land them, and just more using a way for me to go through and do a review and identify what they're recommending in best practices. Okay, so the next phase in there is expanding your landing zone, and as we talked about, they've got the Cloud Adoption Framework landing zone. You could then expand that out with the migration, which allows you then to have that migration tool expanded into your landing zone. But these landing zones aren't just for one big component of your entire Azure build. You can create multiple landing zones per project. And as your cloud footprint grows, your maturity model grows, those landing zones can be expanded and reused. At the time that we were creating our resources in Azure, blueprints were not available. So we were challenged with trying to automate the deployments just using the ARM templates. Having a good guidance within there was not really available. There was not these blueprints to reference. So I think even if you don't plan on using blueprints, I think just having a good understanding of what practices they use for deploying them is beneficial. Last component of the ready phase is regarding best practices and decision guides. These are extremely valuable resources that I'm super excited to be available because your cloud adoption team, depending on their experience, they're making decisions and trying to build these things without really necessarily always having a good understanding of what capabilities Azure provides, let alone the best practices of how to utilize those components and services. And this resource here, I think, is important for any cloud adoption team to be familiar with, to be comfortable with, because those decisions you're going to make are going to be much better with having some of these foundational understandings there. So I highly recommend referencing this. I highly recommend reading this. I believe even if you see yourself as a very experienced Azure cloud user or architect, I really would recommend going and ensuring that you're aligning up and that your understanding is aligned well with these best practices here to kind of facilitate that early adoption of that team that may not be fully skilled up on all of those best practices and technologies. They also provide some pretty cool decision guides that basically help lead you through making these kind of decisions. And these are the kind of things that every organization that I've been in, the best practices and the lack of decision guidance has resulted in quite a bit of technical debt. I have seen when partners are engaged, many of these pitfalls are avoided, and much of the technical debt and need to refactor or change things in their environments, especially like when it comes to things like networking, subscriptions, and things like that. Those things are really high risk, and they're difficult to do without a lot of complexity, without loss of any downtime. So I would definitely follow best practices and use these decision guides to your advantage. So pitfall avoidance on this is make sure your ready is ready. Governance and management are impossible and require large efforts to enable. It's often that cloud adoption team or that cloud adoption team functions as both the cloud adoption and the initial cloud governance team on the initial efforts, which means it doesn't necessarily align with the on-prem or established IT governance. So there's a high likelihood that security standards are non-compliant, which of course leads to a risk of breaches and data loss. And there's a lack of operational efficiencies and inability to align future efforts. I've also seen Bill Shock experience that many times when all of a sudden you're getting these huge wins in the cloud, and the manager comes down and says, what happened to this bill? Where is all this money? And it's usually because there were not proper controls and policy in there. And sometimes something as simple as an excessive amount of logging could run your bill up quite a bit. There's also often problems with performance and latency, and lots of times this is related to not using the appropriate regions, as well as inefficiencies in networking. There's almost always a naming consistency in this situation, and that naming inconsistency can really complicate matters. The tagging is a nice approach and tool to allow you to overcome naming inconsistencies as well, and to allow more flexibility between teams. There's usually a lack of role-based access controls, which we all know what that leads to. The big problem is you end up being, your agility is constrained, because it's really the maturity of that individual team or that individual person as they've crafted, they've built with just only their skill set without utilizing these tools or using a partner. So you've really got a lot of constraints growing beyond their exposure. So now that your environment is established and your ready is made ready, we get on to the final stage of the cloud adoption framework that basically follows within that govern and manage phase, and that's the adopt phases. The adopt phase is generally as you're going through your strategy and you're planning, you're defining migration or innovation efforts. And while there are some differences between them, they align well. They can be worked in tandem. Definitely not for your first project, but often there's an IT team who's migrating at the same time that you've got a more DevOps team innovating. So there's lots of additional resources available on the Cloud Adoption Framework documentation site that goes through more details regarding the accessing these workloads, deploying workloads, and releasing workloads specific to use cases, and they've got good examples within them. With the innovation phase, they also have good examples documented as well on there that basically, and this is ultimately highlighting a customer adoption approach to it here, and the steps within there to build, measure, learn, and breaking down the digital inventions. There's a lot of opportunity when you choose to innovate that lots of times bring a bigger cost savings than the migrate. An understanding of whether you're able to, refactor IaaS solutions into PaaS, or even now we've got functions as a service. They can really accelerate development and experimentation cycles, and older apps can take advantage of many of the same cloud native benefits by modernizing these solutions or components. So that leads us to the final stages of the cloud adoption framework that are not within that cycle of 3 that's iterated through, but the overarching and ongoing governance and manage phases. With the manage phases, I'm going to not delve into that topic. There's lots of those resources available on the Cloud Adoption Framework documentation. And there's also available on there a overview of all the tools, templates, and assessments that are available, starting with the Cloud Journey Tracker, business outcome templates, etc., through each one of those phases. This is kind of a nice little jump off point to all the tools and templates and cool toys that you can go and experiment and play with. I would recommend grabbing the Git repo as well for the Cloud Adoption Framework, and having those resources available. There's tons of good information in here that allows you a little easier navigation as well to go and get some of those resources, as opposed to clicking through all the documentation for things that you want to play with, experiment, and see if you can utilize to smooth your cloud adoption efforts. So with that, I'm going to open it up for Q&A and open discussion.
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat window, but I think this session was very informative. Cloud Adoption Framework is very powerful. With that, I think there are no more questions. I would like to thank you on behalf of the user group